switch when you present so we can see you.
But even while she, maybe we'll just scoot. Otherwise, she'll get a neck ache.
Yeah, we don't want you doing that.
Silence. Oh my gosh. Who's that?
It's your student.
Who?
Yeah, she's your student. I thought she was the person that someone was asking about earlier.
Oh, okay.
I don't know many of our students anymore.
Because
just a
it's
semester.
sabbatical and
It just happens. New ones come in. Just talk. Are most of your classes?
Let's see. We have Corinne, Erica, Polly, Charlotte,
He's in your class.
Oh, no.
He's not? Yeah,
He's
that's
not.
great.
Yep. Not all the students are here.
Yeah. So we still have a few minutes.
There's Brian, who's in my class. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So one might not make it. I'm so glad.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and what's lovely is that it's not all Chaz. But I was going to tell Marquita.
Okay. Yeah, it's okay. All the seats are pretty close.
Like we don't bite.
It's always awkward at first. It's okay. Yeah. I know. I think the class required that.
Right. Right. Yeah, your frame of reference is like, an exhibit opening and people just strolling around. We're like, no, we need to start. Yeah.
Got it. Is that? The surface is surface?
Oh, very cool. I have such an old iPad that right now the operating system can't be updated anymore. I know several apps don't want to work with it anymore. I've had it a long time.
Okay, so it's not, I can't be that touchy.
No.
Like it's a real thing.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I just had to replace my 6-year-old MacBook Air, which I was in love with.
Yeah, this iPad is probably 7.
So that's why I came because I have a MacBook Air, but it just died. Well, I kind of got a warning. The battery just didn't function, so it wouldn't charge.
You can't replace it.
Well, they couldn't because it can also be risky. So, because it actually expanded and stuff. I said, I'm going to cut my losses and just download everything while I still can.
Yeah, I have everything at this point in the cloud. I'm Diana Romero, and I want to welcome you all to class. I'm here with my fellow class colleagues. There are several folks from our class in the audience with other guests, and I'm excited to see all of you here. The class that this sort of was the brainchild of coming into this great space was that this class this semester at the CUNY School of Public Health is on social inequality and reproductive and sexual health policy and rights. And Lynn and I thought it was a great opportunity to bring the conversation of this class out into this beautiful public space, and particularly in light of the exhibit, that surrounds us. So I'm the instructor, but I feel like I'm a part of the group. We meet every other week in person and in between online, and today here at Gavin Brown's Enterprise. I want to thank Marquita Flowers for hosting us here, and in fact, I want to inform you that the reason why we're here is due to, I think, 1 degree of separation, right, between Marquita and Professor Lynn Roberts to my right. That 1 degree of separation was Lynn's wonderful former student and Marquita's mother, Mavis Flowers. So word of this opportunity came by way of Mavis. I just want to say a little more about what Marquita shared with us in terms of this exhibit. The gallery decided to use artist Rikrit Tiruvanij's exhibit as a setting for and backdrop to public discourse. To paraphrase what Marquita shared with us, Tiruvanij's work often blurs the division between art and life, constructing communal environments that offer an alternative venue for quotidian activities. The heart of this show is a stage that we are sitting on, open for public use as a site of congregation, assembly, and discussion. The backdrop to this stage is a series of really impressive paintings depicting the politics around the imaginary wall at the U.S. border. As a response to the current political state of affairs that we're living in, the gallery opened up this platform to function as a site of collective and productive discourse. It's why we're here tonight, and for that we're grateful. And I want to also add that I think it's very much in line with not only the mission of our school, the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, but in particular the department that Lynn and I and many of the students here reside in, the Department of Community Health and Social Sciences. So a couple of words about the class. In the class, we cover reproductive and sexual health issues such as contraception, abortion, and family planning, sexual health topics including HIV, AIDS, other STIs, and school-based sexual health education, welfare and other social policies affecting individuals and families with children or those who want children or who don't want children at a particular time, and also sexual violence, human and reproductive rights, as well as many other topics. We consider these and other issues within the larger context of historical oppression and social movements, rights-based frameworks and intersectional lenses, and quote-unquote old policies and practices, as well as new, shall I say, developments. Sometimes, and unfortunately, at the moment, we experience recycling, unfortunately, of old policies that we thought were history. So unfortunately, the field does not lack for new examples of threats to reproductive health and rights. Thus, we're here tonight to discuss very contemporary examples of policies undermining the integrity of the family and the principles of reproductive justice with 2 leaders in the field on my left and right. So very quickly, I'll turn to why you're all here. On my right is Professor Lynn Roberts, Assistant Professor in the Department of Community Health and Social Sciences at the CUNY School of Public Health. Prior to her time at CUNY, she's been with CUNY for a good while. She oversaw the development, implementation, and evaluation of several programs for women and youth in New York City, including a comprehensive program for substance-using mothers and their families in Harlem. She's an emeritus board member of the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, and co-editor of an anthology that she and several of her colleagues with Sister Song published last year by Feminist Press. It's called Radical Reproductive Justice, Foundations, Theory, Practice, and Critique. Dr. Roberts' current activism and scholarship examine the intersections of race, class, and gender in adolescent dating relationships, juvenile justice, and reproductive health policies, as well as the impact of models of collaborative inquiry and teaching on civic and political engagement. Since 2015, she's been a consultant to the New York City Department of Health in support of their efforts to integrate a sexual and reproductive justice framework in their programs. She serves on the New York City Maternal Mortality and Morbidity Steering Committee and Steering and Review Committees, and on the Governor's Task Force on Maternal Mortality. She's honored to be the mother of 4 amazing human beings, ages 20 to 39, which I don't believe, and is in constant awe of her 6 grandchildren. So, welcome, Lynn. And on my left, we're really thrilled to have Erin Cloud. Ms. Cloud is a team leader and supervising attorney in the family defense practice and the co-director of the Bronx Defenders Holistic Externship Program at Columbia Law School. In addition to representing parents who are entangled in the child welfare system, Ms. Cloud also serves on several committees, such as the Black Mamas Matters Alliance, the Women Who Use Drugs Committee of the Office of Drug User Health at the New York State Department of Health's AIDS Institute, and the New York City Department of Health's Sexual and Reproductive Justice Community Engagement Group, which aims to insert a reproductive justice model into the city's healthcare system. A connection that you two have. Ms. Cloud graduated from Fordham University School of Law, where she was a Stein Scholar for Public Interest and an Anne Moynihan Fellow for Law and Integrative Social Work. She previously interned at the Doors Legal Services Center and at the Bronx Defenders, as well as for the Honorable Dora L. Irisati in the U.S. Eastern District Court of New York. Erin was the recipient of the Archibald P. Murray Award for completing the highest number of pro bono work hours while in law school. She was also the recipient of the Anne Moynihan Prize for Outstanding Clinical Work at the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice. She's a proud mother of 2 children and proud resident of the Bronx. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to our presenters, and we are sure to have, I think, a fair amount of time for what we hope to be a really interesting and active discussion. And if at any point in time people want to get up and have a bite to eat, please do so. So with that note.
Thank you for that rich introduction, and I got to learn a few more things about Erin I didn't know. So I'm going to start us off, and we are going to, I just need this, and we are also going to then switch to Erin before we open it up to all of us to have a discussion. Because this is a class, and as Professor Romero, Diana said, we have a tight time frame, so we want to squeeze a lot in. So we may go through some things and skip over a few aspects of our talk to make sure we have plenty of time to talk with you. I just want to point out what you were viewing as we were convening and gathering was a slideshow of images from a program that I directed. So all those images were families who were part of that program, and it operated right around the corner from this building. So I feel like this is a bit of homecoming for me of 20 years. And you'll learn more about that as well. So a few learning objectives for this evening are to understand the origins, the definition, and timeline of the reproductive justice framework, to also understand the key principles and strategies of reproductive justice. I will speak specifically about the origins of the New York City Department of Health initiative that Diana also mentioned, and that Erin and I are both working, and a few others of you who have joined us this evening, and talking about that in the context of what does it mean to have a municipal community partnership to achieve some of the goals of sexual and reproductive justice and addressing disparities. And then we also have a real I guess framing it within the context of this exhibit, wanted to talk about this in the context of the foster care system. And I couldn't think of anyone more knowledgeable and engaged to talk about that with us than Erin. So we are going to start out, explaining what the reproductive justice framework is before we dive deep into talking about it within the context of family separation. So I always do like, even though I love formal introductions from my colleagues, do like to tell you at least when and where I entered into reproductive justice work. And I started out as end of the Jimmy Carter into the Ronald Reagan era, for those of you who were alive then, to think about ways that, that status in society impacted how I was regarded and also how policies were shaped by that. And reproductive justice became something that made sense to me in understanding better what I had personally experienced as a young parent in that era. And then culminating through my engagement with the family rehabilitation program that operated from 1990 to 1995 here in Harlem during the height of the crack epidemic. And it was a program designed to provide support to keep families together. So again, just wanted to share two of my connections that seem relevant for tonight's conversation, although I could share a lot more. So what exactly is reproductive justice? It's a direct response to reproductive injustice. And reproductive injustice refers to the control and exploitation of cis, trans women and girls and other marginalized people through our bodies, our sexuality, our labor, and our reproduction. And it is this regulation of our bodies that becomes a powerful strategic pathway to controlling entire communities. It involves social injustices and systems of oppression that are based on race, ability, class, gender, sexuality, age, immigration status, to name a few. Reproductive justice is just one of 3 frameworks that have evolved in response to sexual and reproductive injustices. And all 3 are important. They're not, we need all 3, but it is important to distinguish them. And often they work in concert with one another to achieve health equity and other human rights. So I want to go through each one of them. So reproductive health has several hallmarks. It's necessary to have reproductive health services that not only limited to women, but in particular to meet the health service needs of women. It's important that this approach strategizes on improving and expanding services, research and access, and particularly prevention and cultural competency for communities that are underserved. The primary constituents in this framework are patients or clients needing services and or education. There's a focus on providers, medical professionals, community and public health educators, and health service providers. There are a few limitations in that most often these services and education are directed at the individual level, that the root causes of health inequities are often not addressed, that it can be very resource intensive without leading to long-term change, and it can also be limited by the inherent access issues because different people have varying levels of reproductive health literacy and or access to these services. Reproductive rights also has several hallmarks in that this framework analyzes the core problem as a lack of legal protection, the laws or enforcement of laws that ensure an individual woman's or individual's legal right to reproductive health care services, especially abortion. And that couldn't be a more apparent need than right now. The primary strategy is legal legislative advocacy at state and federal levels, People are organized within this framework to participate actively in the political process through the electoral system and encouraged to vote and call their members of Congress or state legislatures. Key players here are advocates, legal experts, policymakers, and elected officials. Some of the challenges of the reproductive rights framework are that it focuses on individual choice, and this often obscures the social context in which individuals make choices. It assumes a level of knowledge, access to elected officials, and belief in the effectiveness of the political system. People may be marginalized by immigration status, age, class, race, ethnicity, and disabilities, and thus often do not have this access, knowledge, or faith in the ability of the system to meet their needs. And so it is that the reproductive justice framework involves a reframing by understanding the historical context of the control of indigenous, immigrant, women, queer, and people of color's sexuality and reproduction and its consequences on their health and well-being. It's also important to listen and respect the self-determination and bodily autonomy of all people, especially the most marginalized within this framework. To practice humility and take risks toward deeper engagement with those who are most marginalized in our society. To join and collaborate with organizations and coalitions led by those who have been left out of the system. It also involves being an informed citizen, a voter, an ally, an advocate, an accomplice, an agitator, by putting some skin in the game and by listening to and reading the writings of those who have been most impacted by their marginalization. And it also offers an opportunity to reflect and work to transform any institutional policies and practices that impede reproductive justice. We define reproductive justice as when all people have the social, political, and economic power and the resources to make healthy decisions about our gender, our bodies, and sexuality for ourselves, our families, and our communities. Reproductive justice aims to transform power inequities and create long-term systemic change, and therefore relies on the leadership of communities most impacted by reproductive oppression. It recognizes that all individuals are part of communities and that our strategies must lift up entire communities in order to support individuals. Just briefly, wanted to give you some historical context that reproductive justice was introduced, the term first coined by a caucus of black women who were gathered in Chicago in 1994. It was the time of the first healthcare reform movement under the then Clinton administration, and they were really interested in why some of those proposals and other initiatives weren't speaking as clearly and specifically to their needs, the needs of women of color, poor women in particular. And so they wanted to combine the notion, concepts related to human rights with social justice, and of course putting it in the context of reproductive health and rights. They recognize the need for applying an intersectional analysis defined by the human rights framework and based also on the practice of self-help and community care. And that came from the fact that they weren't the first ones to think about these issues in this way. In actuality, they were very much aware of those who had come before them, and they stood on their shoulders, but they felt that they needed to build into their efforts, especially their movement building, in a way that didn't also lead to what sometimes happened in those prior movements, where folks kind of, through their own reaction to their experiences of marginalization or oppression, kind of turned that inward towards each other, and wanted to include that as actually a part of the framework and a part of the strategy, which hadn't been done as clearly before. I'm not going to go over this timeline, but just give you a sense that there were a lot of meetings, particularly international meetings. We were very much informed by women all over the world who were also having these conversations that were being lifted up in these international meetings and gatherings. And each one of these meetings introduced newer concepts and an expansion of human rights specific to the needs and the reproductive health needs and rights of women in particular. And it's not an exhaustive timeline, but just wanted, again, to put it in some historical context. These are the key principles of reproductive justice, and you'll hear us repeat this throughout our discourse this evening, that every individual has the human right to decide if and when to have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth or create a family, to decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing or ending a pregnancy, and this one that we'll talk a lot about this evening, to parent the child or children they want or already have with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities and without the threat of harm from individuals, organizations, or institutions of the state. And fourth, the right to bodily autonomy from any form of sexual or reproductive oppression. And we're going to cite some examples this evening as well. So does that seem pretty clear? Who has heard of the Reproductive Justice Framework before? Okay, so many of you are already familiar, so pardon my redundancy. Next, I want to talk about the core elements of the framework, and as has been mentioned, first and foremost is that of intersectionality. And this is a theoretical model that was developed by women of color in the 1960s to 70s to address how oppression based on race, class, and gender affects women of color. The term intersectionality was first coined, at least in the written form, by critical race scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, and was later expounded upon by Patricia Hill Collins in her seminal book, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. I will also note that there is a long history, if you will, of intersectional analysis and organizing that predated the use of this term, and the concept has since been expanded to recognize ways in which interlocking systems of oppression impact on the bodies, families, and communities of all those who have been marginalized based on their social identities and status. These systems of inequality work in concert to create what is often referred to as a matrix of domination, and the framework of intersectionality acknowledges the multiple social identities that everyone has, and it explicitly centers those who have been most marginalized by privileging their unique ways of knowing the world based on their lived experiences. The second element, as I've discussed in describing the timeline and evolution of reproductive justice, is that of human rights. This is a really core element because it is based on what are universally accepted laws as declared by the United Nations, which asserts the inherent rights of individuals to make personal decisions about one's life, and the obligation of government and society to ensure that the conditions are suitable for implementing one's decisions, the social conditions, the structures of our society. And they are universal, meaning they apply to all persons, not restricted to any protected class or group. They are based on humankind's increasing demand for a life in which the inherent dignity and worth of each human being will be respected and protected. What might not be as familiar to everyone is that there are actually 8 categories of human rights, not all of which existed back in 1948, but that again evolved through many of our discourses over the decades since. And I just want to hold these up because all of these hang together as a collective body that we call human rights, but sometimes it's good to look at them specifically in these categories to see what we're actually referring to. And a lot of what we often codify in U.S. domestic policy is based on civil rights. And I think it's important that that's a part, but when we talk about human rights, we're talking about civil rights connected to all of these other categories of rights. And as I mentioned, a key principle was self-help, but it's also part of, you know, it's even bigger than that, and I'm going to even talk about it again as part of strategy. So you'll hear this a lot, this idea that revealing human rights violations by people being able to share what they've experienced and be validated in a community of caring around these violations, and to be able to initiate a process of healing and restoration through a collective concept. Even though this element and the idea of self-help within the context of reproductive justice suggests it's an individual thing, it is not. It is a collective approach to ensuring that the individual receives what they need in a caring community. And just to give it a little context, I have to give credit to the Black Women's Health Movement. If you've heard of Billie Avery or read about her work, that these concepts were introduced well before the reproductive justice movement, but the reproductive justice movement embraces them and consider it vital to our practice and incorporate it in how we work together. So it can involve revealing stories of human rights violations and also using self-disclosure through storytelling. So speaking of strategies, I want to share, and then I'm going to move very quickly, that there are several things that we do. We focus on addressing the intersecting systems of oppression and inequity. We analyze and work to change unjust systems of power. When necessary, we take direct action. We center the most marginalized and support their leadership. And that involves providing sustainable long-term funding, supporting capacity building, consulting prior to and not after new initiatives, bringing folks to the table when making decisions that will impact them, sharing resources, sharing credit, and educating ourselves to practice and becoming better allies to others. Because all of us can be in both a marginalized status and a more privileged one simultaneously. So all of us can practice being better allies to someone else who doesn't share our particular type of privilege. We build and sustain a power base by listening to, engaging, and mobilizing communities most affected by sexual and reproductive justice to address those issues most important to them. We build and support a network of allied social justice organizations who integrate a reproductive justice analysis and agenda into their work. We educate our current electeds about reproductive justice, and we groom and support new candidates for office. We encourage voter registration. We educate the public on the issues and fight against voter suppression. And as I said, we also engage in the practice of radical self-care that can be practiced on an individual, institutional, and community level. And storytelling is a primary strategy, and I think I've indicated that previously, so I want to move on to some of the challenges of reproductive justice as a framework. It can challenge people personally and politically by asking them to adopt a worldview that is diametrically opposed to the status quo. It can involve taking risks, including taking direct action against those who abuse power. And to truly achieve transformational change, it requires more resources and staying power than are often available or readily available. Even the potential for radical transformation can alarm or make cynics of many across the political spectrum. It's not for the faint of heart. And those of us who are indigenous, immigrant, women of color, who are queer, people of color, who are engaged in reproductive justice frequently show up for others, but others do not necessarily show up for us when the going gets rough. And when they do, it is often too little and too late. And an intersectional analysis within reproductive justice is central to securing the human rights of all people, although it has been developed by and for women of color. It is believed that if we have reproductive justice for those who've been most marginalized, we will all benefit. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the reproductive justice framework as it's being applied in New York City by giving you a little backstory that New York City had had several instances of reproductive injustices. Most notably was the very disturbing involuntary sterilization of Puerto Rican women here in New York and also on the island of Puerto Rico. And it was very disturbing, and many people organized and mobilized around that. Even when there wasn't a language of reproductive justice, they were doing reproductive justice work here in New York City. A few years ago, there was this on my left, your right, there was this ad that appeared in New York City. It was developed by the Human Resources Administration, and it was a very shaming campaign around young parents. And at the time, we did not have a reproductive justice organization based in New York City, but there were many advocates, and they mobilized about that campaign. That was the first start of having conversations, explicit conversations about reproductive justice in regard to an agency. So I bring up these two examples. Both of them involved challenging institutions around what they were doing around sterilization. The policies for the federal policies around consent around sterilization were developed by the activism in New York City. And the activism around the campaign, this particular campaign, which is really shaming young parents through these very kind of, statements that were pretty, exaggerated and fear-mongering, I guess. So those led to a campaign that was introduced not those led to, but those preceded a campaign in 2014 by the New York City Department of Health called Maybe the IUD that was interested in increasing access to LARCs. But there were two students from our program, two MPH interns at the time, who were concerned that the campaign, the way it was initially conceived, might have been focusing or overly promoting to particular groups within New York City. And so they invited me to campus, and I came and gave a talk about reproductive justice to the Sexual Reproductive Health Unit. Several of my colleagues, including Diana Romero and others, were also engaged in conversations with them about that campaign. And it eventually led to bringing in some reproductive justice advocates and others to plan a gathering, a meeting of community members in the tradition and strategies used by reproductive justice to bring those who are most impacted by a particular issue together in dialogue to inform decision makers around an issue. And that meeting was held in June of 2015, and it led to the formation of what is now known as the Community Engagement Group. I'm going to go through this quickly. We held community gatherings to talk with folks who were in various communities of New York City and developed a video that was designed to, in the second year of this 5-year funded campaign, which was all to be about long-acting reversible contraceptives, which is considered a very effective method, but also our concern was that it shouldn't be the only method promoted, that folks should understand the full range of options and should also be able to consider other needs they have in the context of their reproductive health. So this video was developed by community members in the CEG to introduce the framework to really to New York City, and it's 3 minutes long. I think we can show it right now because I think it's a good example of when a community does work as opposed to, say, an advertising firm, or I have my colleague who does social marketing here in public health, but this was a community-developed video.
What first brought me to reproductive justice wasn't my experience of having an abortion. It was actually my experience of giving birth. I was pregnant during law school and at the time was a Medicaid recipient. Decisions were made about me without my input. We would ask questions and people literally ignored us.
When it comes to sexual assault, I've had 4 incidences in my life that I can remember. What I did initially, before I talked to somebody, before I got counseling, self-medicate. I felt guilty. I felt like it was my fault.
The first time that I had an abortion, I went into the waiting room and was so shocked to see another Asian woman in the room. If you're dealing with issues related to your reproductive health and you're not seeing your community or your stories reflected in that conversation, you're all alone.
I would have loved if there was sex education in my schools. It would have been great to see 2 women in love, and especially 2 black women in love. But there was no visibility for people that look like me.
Sexual reproductive justice, had I been exposed to it younger, could have changed the way I valued myself.
We have to acknowledge that there is a history of women being coerced into contraceptive choices that were not ones that they either understood or chose.
The experience of being treated as a non-person really made the cesarean surgery traumatizing and frightening in a way that it really didn't have to be.
No woman wants to have crappy schools.
A parent has the right for their child to grow up healthy and happy and affirmed.
My body is my body.
No one, no entity, no clinic, no boyfriend, parent can make decisions for my body.
Coming from an immigrant community, there wasn't a lot of trans-friendly services or trans-knowledgeable doctors that I knew of growing up.
Black women in New York City are 12 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And this is just one of the many inequities that a sexual and reproductive justice framework seeks to correct.
To see government agencies bringing us together to hear our thoughts about sexual and reproductive justice. That is a very big, huge step.
In order to heal our community, we need to hear from everyone.
Your voice is important. We want to hear from you.
Discussion guide that accompanies, and this can use to start conversations in a variety of settings throughout New York City. We've used this in grand rounds with providers. We've used it in community meetings with folks who are being trained as, we now call them birth justice defenders, who are women who have given birth in New York City and who are now becoming self-advocates for better birthing experiences. So this is our current campaign that was chosen through a democratic process. There were other issues that the CEG was interested. They wanted to also focus on comprehensive sex education and may get to that in a future campaign, but right now with the maternal mortality as high as it is and those disparities, this was chosen by community to be a focus of our efforts. Very briefly, I'm going to wrap it up here before turning things over to Erin to talk about some of the highlights of this partnership between community and the New York City Department of Health. We have over 60 active CEG members who meet monthly for 4 hours, at least once a month, and then have several other meetings several times a week in work groups that actually advise the work of the Department of Health related to, right now, primarily around birth justice. We work really hard to amplify those voices that are seldom heard by government and agencies that provide care. We have challenged business as usual at the Department of Health in a variety of ways. Even how that video was created was changing business as usual. And I could cite several examples, but not in the time that we have. Several DOH staff have risen in their leadership roles as a result of this initiative. We have included institutional transformation as a priority, as challenging as that can be, and we have co-presented at conferences including the American Public Health Association and City Match. Some of the challenges have been fluctuations in the membership and participation of CEG members, how well we are able to hold ourselves accountable to who we consider centered communities of New York City. Are we reaching the most marginalized? It's kind of a privilege to be able to come to a 4-hour meeting once a month, so we always are mindful of that, but always finding ways to hold ourselves more accountable. Cultivating and sustaining trust with a group that is wildly fluctuating and has people who come from a variety of standpoints. The staff and the community capacity is taxed with the work that we've taken on and are attempting to do. There are persistent bureaucratic obstacles about what you can and can't do with government funds. And the sustainability of government commitments over time are always at the back of our minds. So at this time, and in spite of that, we are still continuing with the CEG, and a lot is happening. I can talk to anyone who wants to learn more about how to become involved with those efforts. I'm going to turn things over. I'm going to switch seats here with Erin, who's going to take this discussion a little deeper.
Hi, everybody. I'm not really a mic person, so let's see how this works. But CEG is a good transition because that is how we met each other. I have been a public defender for the last 7, 8, I think maybe 8 years now. Before that, I was a teacher. I did not expect to get into the field of reproductive justice. In fact, when I started law school and was introduced and reintroduced, I went to an all-girls school. We talked a lot about reproductive rights, and it didn't appeal to me. I didn't understand it. It didn't really seem like a place where I was connected. And quite honestly, because I didn't see black women in it. So it didn't resonate with me. And it wasn't until I really started work as a public defender and working with largely mothers and parents in the system that I started to be grounded in this framework, and I started to kind of, all of a sudden, I saw people talking about black women. And it became a construct that then resonated and has become something that has become foundational to our work. So the Bronx Defenders is a community-based holistic public defense organization. We've been around since 1997. We have an organization that we kind of developed from Neighborhood Defender Services, which was kind of the original holistic public defense and community-based public defender's office, which is down on 125th Street. And both of those offices have really recognized that the prison, deportation, housing, foster systems are all punitive and use family separation as a way to control marginalized communities. So our model is basically depicted in this graph that if you go on our website, you'll see it's interactive, it's very cool, but it has this client at the center. And really what it means is that all these different systems interact and impact our clients, and all those different players are people that become a part of their legal team. So it goes from social workers to a family defense attorney, an immigration attorney, a criminal defense attorney, a housing attorney, whatever our client needs. And through the process and evolution of what a client needs, we develop our program. So approximately 5 years ago, and I'll talk more about this later, we started partnering with doulas. And we started partnering with doulas in a radical way to defeat the system that was removing children from our clients. And we believe that that is a part of the holistic defense model, is what are other ways and who are other people that we can rely on to ensure that we mitigate the impact of systems in our clients' lives and maintain as much stability as possible. So I always like to start from the framework and just a reminder that family is a fundamental right. We have these fundamental liberties in the United States. And when we talk about a fundamental liberty, this should be one of the highest rights that we preserve, one of the highest rights that we protect, and it should be given the most amount of protections. And when we think about family as a fundamental right, we have to understand there's a parallel right for a parent to be able to raise a child, but a child to also be able to live in a family. And those parallel rights are what we fight for. And this comes from a long line of cases. I string cited all the Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Lawrence versus Texas, Loving versus Virginia, Meyer versus Nebraska. Those are kind of the quintessential reproductive rights cases. Those are the cases that you look at when you're thinking about what is access to choice, how do you develop what is the development of personhood and a fetus. And what people tend to kind of leave out when they're thinking about those cases is they also reinforce the sphere of privacy around the family. They also reinforce this importance of parenting, this importance of having a family. And we have protected those reproductive rights because we protect this liberty interest not only in pregnancy, but also in families. So we think about that fundamental right. Oh, you had the clicker. Yeah. That's right. I was like, this is magically going.
I thought I was helping.
Thank you. You were very helpful. We think about that fundamental right, and now we think about the reality. The nice thing about working in law is, like many practices that you guys may be a part of, it really does face you with a direct hypocrisy of what it means to be a person of color. Like, I read a piece of paper that says a fundamental right, but then I know overwhelmingly Black, brown, immigrant, and poor families are more likely to have this fundamental right eviscerated. I walk into my job, and in family court, everyone's brown or Black. Everyone looks like me. I walk into criminal court, everyone looks like me. I walk into, Varick Street, Hudson, in detention centers, and everyone's brown. So that really nice, shiny piece of paper that sits in the Supreme Court decisions that seems to really elevate this right just doesn't seem realistic when you actually look at it in real life. So why? Why is it that we're so willing to separate poor Black, brown, immigrant families? Why, when we have revered it through years of law, is that something that we eviscerate? So I have a friend who's a historian. That's a nice compliment in your life when you can ask these questions to historians. And he writes about this and talks about enslaved people lived with a perpetual possibility of separation through the sale of one or more family members, right? That perpetual fear that your family will not be your family when you come home. That is rooted in who we are as a people in this country. And it continues to exist today. Enslaved families were divided for inheritance when an owner died because the owner or adult's children moved away to create new lives, taking some of the enslaved people with them or not. we remember and we acknowledge that the slave trade in North America commodified black children and became its self-propagating own economy through the wombs of black women. So the financial relationship between a black uterus and a black child is something that is intrinsic to our own historical identity. So we watch the border, and I am deeply moved by seeing the depiction of the border around us because I think about borders a lot. Borders are completely fictional. They're not real. The reason I do law is because it is not real. Law is not a real thing. It's something that people get together, that they write and they decide is going to exist and order us in society. Borders are also one of those things. There's no reason that because someone's born in one place that they are determined illegal in another place. That is fictional. These concepts of what create legality is fictional. It is a decision that we have decided to make, and when I say we, I mean not black and brown people have decided to make, not immigrants have decided to make, but that other people have decided to create divisions and create separations. So what is a border really? A border is a jail. A border is a foster system. A border is a political difference between two different countries. If you can't see your child, you exist between two sides of a border. And when they had one of the press conferences about the border crisis and that they were just removing these children from asylum seekers, the DHS secretary for Trump says, she kind of shrugs her shoulders and says, well, family separation is really a fact of life here. In the United States, we call that law enforcement. She's not wrong. When we look at housing and rates of evictions, an analysis of aggregate data shows us that neighborhoods with a high percentage of children also experience increased evictions. An analysis of individual data based on surveys, and this is, if you guys have read Professor Desmond, he has the book Eviction that many people might have read. But he also has a specific piece where he discusses the rates of eviction when it comes to mothers and families. And he talks about the lack of research about the motivations of evictions. He talks about the high incidence of evictions based on families and evicting single mothers. And he talks about this increased data. When we're looking at incarceration, 250,000 American children are estimated to have a single mother in jail. Black women are the highest growing population of incarcerated bodies right now. And most of us are caretakers. Incarcerating children. More than 30,000 children are in juvenile proceedings, and more than 50% of these offenders, this is from the Sentencing Project, are being held for nonviolent offenses and what they would deem crimes that are only crimes based on your age. So that means truancy, curfew violations, age-based violations that are separating families. So not just locking up parents, but locking up children. And we think about why that is. I think very often we talk about the 90s, late 80s and 90s and legislation in silo. We talk about each piece of legislation as if they were not made by the same groups of people. So we tend to talk about the crime bill. So a lot of people heard a lot during the election about the crime bill. We heard a lot about how that made mass incarceration and grew this prison population. We heard that word, the super predators, right? We heard Hillary Clinton talk and label juvenile offenders, quote unquote, as super predators. But we didn't hear quite as much about IRIRA. So what is IRIRA? IRIRA was a massive overhaul of the immigration laws and led to increased deportations. It changed and recodified what determines the eligibility of removal. It turned two possessions of marijuana into a felony. Like, the fascinating thing about immigration law is that it is absolutely ludicrous. It makes no sense, and it has a definition section, like most statutes do, where it can redefine a word. So what is a felony when you are looking at immigration law is not what we deem a felony when you're looking at criminal law. So when they're saying we're deporting all these felons, that's just something someone created and said, well, now we're calling this a felony. We're calling 2 possessions of marijuana a felony. It's not real. So that happened in the 90s, in 1996, and then we had welfare reform at the same time period, right? So we're looking at welfare reform, and I'm very excited. I was telling Lynn to meet in person Diana Romero, because I read a lot of her stuff. I read the book, and I read all of her things that she has written over a long period of time when she talks about the Clinton welfare reform. Deeply racialized. I think we're at the point now where we can just say that out loud in most circles and understand that it was based on tropes of what we decided was the welfare queen, based on concepts and restrictive and privatizing most parts of our economy at the expense of Black women, creating connections between public subsidies and our sexual reproductive health, making sure that we put limits, because obviously our poverty was related to our lack of desire to work, and not because of social infrastructures and inequities, all of which happening at the same time as mass deportations, the crime bill, and then there's also this silent one, which is ASFA. Nobody talks about it. ASFA actually in the last election was deemed a success. We actually heard in progressive circles that ASFA was deemed a success. And they're not wrong. So this is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. It was enacted in 1997, and it fast-tracked adoptions. It said that no longer are we going to encourage family preservation. We've done that for too long. Instead, we are going to give parents 15 months to quote-unquote get it together. And after those 15 months, we are going to terminate parental rights because children need quote-unquote permanency. And it sounds really nice. When I say it out loud, it sounds great, right? Like, kids were just languishing in this system, and we just need to make sure that we find a stable place for them. But the reality is that didn't exist. It didn't increase the rates of stability for children. There were no magical green grass suburbs for people to go to. And that especially was not true when it came for Black children. And what we can say also at this time, when you're locking up, Black men at high disproportionate rates, you're deporting immigrant families at disproportionate rates, you're cutting all of the social supports for families to be able to pay for structural supports, such as housing subsidies, of cash assistance. It creates a system where you can barely support the children that you are supposed to raise, let alone in 15 months. And we put men behind bars at that time period, and we put them away disproportionately, and that became a way to privatize their bodies. By cutting assistance in welfare, and then taking children out and paying only benefits for those child when they were out of the family's care, we then were able to ensure that we didn't have to pay for the whole Black family unit. We no longer had to pay for the mother because they didn't have the child. The child goes to a foster resource. We cut their benefits, and we make sure the Black male is incarcerated, privatized, and now costing us a lot less money than if we had to actually pay for a social support network. So it's not shocking that these graphs all reflect each other. And I will apologize, they're not completely in line. One day in my infinite amount of time, which is nothing because I have 2 toddlers, I would love to actually proportionally create these graphs. But what we know and what we see is that we have similar spikes. So we have similar spikes in the 90s of incarcerated Americans as we do for deportations, as we do for foster care statistics. So we look at the height of foster care is at the end of the 90s and the 2000s. who is in this system? If we care about child safety, let's just think about this. Are white parents better parents? Do they engage in less drug use? Do they engage in less alcohol use? Are they immune from intimate partner violence? All the things that track what we call neglectful parents track among all races. However, when we look at this map on the left side, every single state that's colored in has a disproportionality of disproportionate representation of minority children in foster care systems. So there are 2 states, Oregon and Hawaii, who do not have a disproportionate amount of black children in foster care. So 48 out of 50 states need to learn a little bit more from Oregon and Hawaii, including New York. Yeah.
Sorry, was Oregon created specifically to have the black people in it?
Correct. You're right. Let's not learn from them. Correct. So what we know is that the national data reveals that black children make up about 33% of the children in the child welfare system, despite representing only 15% of the children in the general population. A black child is 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care as a white child. And at every point of intervention, black children fare worse. They're more likely to be reported. Once reported, they're less likely to receive in-home services. Once they're less likely to receive in-home services, they're more likely to be removed. Then they're more likely to be placed in stranger foster care. And all of these things have to do with each other. They're more likely to be placed in stranger foster care because their relatives are less likely to be able to A, pay for them with financial subsidies and support, B, be able to take them into their homes because they live in public housings which have caps on family compositions, and are over-policed. So if you have contacts with any types of systems like a prior arrest or a prior conviction, you're not eligible to care for your child as in a foster home. If you are an immigrant family, you're not eligible to be a foster parent because you're not eligible to be certified because you're undocumented. And all these systems work together and create this kind of monumental snowballing effect of making these systems full of black and brown children. Shares common themes of reproductive oppression, which is deeply rooted in America's history. So we need to remember that false science and religion were used to justify our inferiority in colonial America. How does that relate to the foster system? So many ways, but I'm going to give you a few. First, many of the foster care agencies are religiously based. I'll talk more about it later on, but even in the development of sexual and reproductive rights, many of the foster care agencies would not teach children about contraception. They use religious exemptions to do so. And a lot of that was they were fostering children and wanting to, quote unquote, save children based on moral ideas that were not consistent with community-based support. Concepts of propaganda and false science. We're going to talk a little bit more about the crack epidemic. We know now that what we learned about quote-unquote crack babies, which is patently untrue, that the science that led to that imagined epidemic was not good science. The very scientists that stated that there could be a generation of children that would be subhuman, were their words, we know they have rejected. It was based on a study of 8 children, and they said it was not corroborated, and they have now retroactively taken back all of those statements, and the New York Times actually took back all their stories. Yet we are still living with the legacy of that mindset and the legacy of that false science, and we're still living with the acceptance of false science to regulate black families. Anti-miscegenation laws reinforce our subordination, legitimize rape for profit. We have to understand, and what I like to say to people very often, just because it's a law doesn't make it right. And that seems so logical. But what is to say that the laws that we experience now, the laws that we hold true about what is safety, what is a family, what is an appropriate home, what is to say that that is not the untrue law today? I think that every law needs to be deeply, deeply questioned. Eugenics was formalized race science designed to eliminate our existence. So we're going to talk about people with disabilities. There's a Supreme Court case called Buck v. Bell. It comes out, I think, in the 1920s and basically states that you can sterilize people with intellectual disabilities for the good of the race. It is actually still good law. It has never been overturned. At this time, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more later on, right now, currently, ACS, the Child Protective Services, is fighting litigation to say that they have to comply with the ADA. 80% of individuals with disabilities have their children removed from them if they're under the poverty line. They have their children removed, and then the very agency who said they're removing their children said that they don't have to comply with any type of accommodations to get their children back. So what are we doing? What are we saying here? Does it mimic these 1920s eugenics law that stated that simply because someone has a disability, they should not be able to have children? We've moved away from saying forced sterilization. That seems pretty taboo in most circles these days. But are we effectively doing that if we remove children en masse from a population based on their disabilities and provide them no support or assistance to get their children back? Thinking about the Moynihan Report, expanding the mythology of Black maternal unfitness, building on this imagery of the Black inferiority, welfare clean, explicitly connecting wealth and poverty to birth and maternal unfitness. I can't stress how important this Moynihan Report and the concept of what it meant to be of Black inferiority and this concept of who we were as Black women, how it really pervades much of the social welfare literature and really allows many of the policies to be built on a default of maternal unfitness, especially for Black and low-income women. So, see, this is the problem. You know, click one thing and click the other thing. We think of these things as being old. The crack babies is the worst threat is the mom herself. This is the legacy of most of us sitting here. We remember this literature and many of the judges. If we say this and we mean this, the worst threat is the mom herself. That means why have structural supports? Why increase access to housing? Why increase access to food stamps, access to good nutrition, access to universal health care? Because that's not the problem. The problem is this mom. And we see that reflected even today with the opiate crisis. So this was a decision that came out approximately 2 years ago, and it's in upstate New York by a progressive judge, a white woman, and she orders this woman to not conceive any other children. Woman struggles with opiates, and she was ordered to listen to her birth control counseling, to see her OBGYN doctor for whatever confidential advice, which is not confidential if you're court ordered to do it, regarding birth control, sexual transmitted diseases, and anything else, to see her regular medical doctor, according her, generally including her addiction, I think I have some typos, to take whatever steps she chooses at no financial cost to her, so nice, to prevent her from conceiving another child fathered by anyone, forever. So these are things that are happening right now. And what is really painful to understand is that within this decision, the judge says it must be understood that in addition to the potential of death to a fetus if a mother overdoses on heroin, an all too common reality, and the potential of a long, painful withdrawal for a newborn baby addicted to his mother's drug of choice, there's another horrible potential future for the child of an addict, which also motivates this court to order the mother not to get pregnant again. Why drug-addicted prostituting mothers of little children in our very own community often sell the use of their little children's bodies to their johns, thus allowing their little children to be raped and sexually abused by those adult men in their own beds for just a few extra dollars. That was not the case. The case was about her using opiates. But that's where the judge's mind was. And so we have to be, it's insane, but y'all, this happened 2 years ago. It's still happening. It's not overturned yet. The foster care system has always prioritized socialization over child safety. So Charles Loring Brace is considered the father of, Reverend Charles Loring Brace, considered the father of modern foster care system. So the foster care system has been about an attempt to socialize people at the bottom of race, class, and gender hierarchies to hold correct values and have the correct kind of family. It was essentially designed to regulate non-white immigrant populations that were seen as troublesome and was justified by the public perception that these children would become a drain on society and would grow up to be criminal or violent if their parents passed on moral or deviant negative behaviors, morals, and values. So what happened was that they went into immigrant communities of children who had families. They took those children from those families and they shipped them out west on the orphan train. They shipped them out west on the orphan train and had them work for Western families to develop the West, many as farm hands, and it also became the basis of many of our child labor laws and our sexual exploitation laws. And why I think it's important to talk about this is the root of that system. We can't be anti-racist if we don't understand where we came from. And why it's incredibly important to talk about this is that to this day, Children's Aid references its relationship with the orphan train movement, but a current screenshot of their website, this is how they describe it, as an ambitious and controversial social experiment that is now recognized as the beginning of the foster care system in the United States. Deeply problematic. Not only is it rooted in social control, but it's also rooted in assimilation. So what we know about the foster care system, and I would like to work on taking the word care away, is that it also took Native Americans from their home, indigenous people, and took the savage out of them. Removing Native children from their families and tribes of origin was once the federal policy in the United States. So, rethinking what is considered safety, right? One of the key aspects of assimilation is found in the phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," which was uttered in 1892 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, an Army officer who founded the Carlisle Indian School, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It served as the model of the boarding school across the U.S. and Canada. Pratt preached education which was to civilize the natives. By 1970s, research found that approximately 25 to 35% of all Native American children in the U.S. were being placed in foster homes, adoptive homes, or institutions. And 85% of these children were placed outside of their families and communities, even when fit and willing relatives were available to care for them. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, which is considered the gold standard of child welfare legislation, was created in response to a crisis affecting Native American, Indian, and Alaskan children, families, and tribes. And what it did was it said there had to be a higher standard to put a Native American child in foster care. We still have no equivalent for any other brown or black or immigrant population, even though there's very similar roots in the oppression. And I would say we still have a long way to go in implementing ICWA in an equitable way. And moving back into the 90s, we think about, well, why did this all happen? So you'll see two different bars. It's a pretty easy graph to look at. The subsidy funds are in a block grant in Title IV. So Title IV-E and Title IV-B are basically the two ways you fund the foster system. 4E covers a portion of what is the out-of-home removal. 4B is what we call family preservation. So all the services that keep a child home. Guess which bar that is, the gray bar or the black bar? It's the black bar. While you'll see on the right side, increasingly every year, that gray bar goes up and up and up. What do we see here in our spending? 55% goes to 4E. That's foster care funding. Whereas everything on the left is what keeps a child home. So we're looking at Medicaid. That's what's going to give you your therapy, your access to health care, your TANF. Your 4B, that little blue little nugget there, that's your actual preventive services. So the grants that are social services funded by ACS actually is theoretically supposed to keep your kids home. And what we also know by looking at, the right side of the pie chart is those are constantly the subsidies that are under attack. So let's apply the framework to child welfare proceedings. So in the foster system, women cannot decide when and if they will have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth to create a family. Here are some examples. If you are a young mother in foster care, you're not deciding the conditions around your birth. Your parent is the government. The government is involved in your birth at all points of your mothering. There is no decision without the government. If you disagree with how you want to birth your child and you are in foster care, they will file a case on you. They will report you. You will have to consult with some form of government official. It doesn't matter that that official is a foster care agency social worker, a child protective worker. That is an affiliate of the government. It is not confidential. Involuntary terminations of parental rights and terminations generally. If you have ever lost a child in the past and that child was removed from you and you chose to fight your case, so you have two options if you get to a place where your child is removed from you. We talk about how difficult it is to get that child back, all the things that the barriers against you. So if you get to that last stage where they're saying we're going to adopt your kid out, you can either agree and take a plea and do a surrender for your child, or you can fight for your child not to be adopted. If you fight for your child not to be adopted and you lose, all of your future children, the government does not have to plan to ever return those kids back to you when they are born. Wait, what? All of your future children. So future you is looking back at past you, being like, girl, what you doing? You need to just surrender that kid, give him up. Talk about coercion. And when you think about those historical legacies, all those things, all those kids we remove based on all the faulty science, all the kids we continue to remove, all the lack of subsidies to keep kids home, and who that disproportionately impacts, think of the conundrum that our community faces. Child Safety Alert 14. So this is a policy by ACS in New York. The first two apply nationally, more egregiously outside of New York, involuntary terminations. Child Safety Alert 14 is a policy that is a New York policy, but different iterations exist across the country and applies to pregnant women with open CPS cases. The policy requires a pre-birth planning conference to occur at the contract foster care agency when a woman is discovered to be pregnant. The discovery of pregnancy is always exciting, right? So if you have a child and you have a child that's in foster care and you're pregnant again, what happens is that they're supposed to plan with you. They do not very often plan with you, but very often simply by having another child at foster care at birth, you will have that child removed from you, or at least have your ACS come to your birth. And when I say come to your birth, they literally come to the bedside to talk to you. And when I say talk to you, to tell you what you have to do at your bedside table. So women in the foster system cannot control the conditions under which they give birth. So I say this all the time. When my clients talk to me about pregnancy planning, their birth plan is very simple. Leave the hospital with a baby. There's no other birth planning that's happening with them. And why? It's because hospitals are regularly drug testing women without their consent. This is disproportionately done for Black women. Hospitals become a place of trauma and fear for Black women in the foster system. Women have no access to birth justice or the liberties that create equitable birthing and health outcomes. If your only goal is to leave the hospital with a baby because you are so fearful of the system that tests, reports, and removes your child, you're not able to advocate for yourself, even if all things were equitable, right? Which we know they are not. And speaking of which, we talk about the widening maternal mortality gap. So, cool, I have 5 minutes, guys. And one of the things that we're interested in looking at is how this coercion and CPS plays a role in the widening maternal mortality gap. What are ways that we can work together to ensure that our clients are able to be heard in these situations? You cannot create a family free from government intrusion. So once a report is made on your family that you are birthed, if you had a prior termination, if you're a child in foster care, if you are a mother in foster care, they hold a safety conference when you are supposed to be planning around this birth. A safety conference creates a service plan that you have to comply with to keep your child in your care. So the way that you design your family is now decided by the government and not by you. And so Dorothy Roberts actually writes about this. She has a study in Chicago, a Woodland study, and she talks about the severe interruption to community consciousness that CPS plays in low-income communities of color. That there's a silent, but not so silent, co-parent that comes into low-income communities telling you how to raise your kids. And imagine the impact that has on political consciousness of a community if we have the government as another parental figure in our homes telling us how to lead our homes. Even if your child is released back to your care, there's orders telling you, they're parole orders, they're literally called parole, your kid's paroled to your care, you're on parole, how to live your life. You can't decide if they will have a child, or the options for preventing pregnancies. Just anecdotally, I had a client once that her child was given 2 days to take the Plan B pill or not take the Plan B pill, and if she didn't take the Plan B pill, they were going to call CPS on her. She was 18 years old. In the foster system, parents cannot parent with the necessary social supports. I mean, research shows that the laws that punish women that are pregnant are increasing, and CPS is the way to do that. So this is a graph of laws that around substance-using mothers and substance-using pregnant women from 1970 to 2016. And what you will notice in 1971 state had laws regulating substance use in pregnancy. Now every state does, and the highest rate to regulate pregnancy and substance use is now, you see that little black circle, is CPS. And the next one underneath it, because they actually divided out two forms of the laws. One is CPS as the highest amount, but CPS is a punitive measure. The squares underneath it are CPS as treatment. So there are places and are mechanisms of diversionary treatment, but that is not the increasing way to regulate pregnancy and substance use. So I'll give you a nice case example of a client of mine who she went to the hospital, her child tested positive for marijuana. This was done without her consent or her knowledge, according to the hospital records, which means they went into her records without her consent and read her birth records and her prenatal records. 3 years ago, she also had a baby who tested positive for marijuana at birth. She is not in a program. Father admits to smoking marijuana on and off for about 12 years. Father became, quote-unquote, aggressive to hospital staff. Security had to be called to assist with father's, quote-unquote, erratic outbursts. Why was, quote-unquote, father erratic? Because he was not able to leave the hospital with his baby. He was very upset that his son was removed from his care and was very disappointed to find out that his child he could not leave with. This couple, there were no indicators, there's nothing wrong with this child, a completely healthy child. The 3-year-old was a completely healthy, thriving child, up to date with all of their pediatrician. Everything was up to date, everything was going well. They were living together at a shelter. The children, both of them were emergency room placed in emergency foster care placement, even though they had a resource, was a sister that was able to care for the child, but the ACS deemed that department too small, so both children were removed. As a consequence of the removal, they were in a PATH shelter, which is a family shelter. They were no longer considered a family any longer, so they had to leave. They were kicked out and moved to separate single individual shelters because they were not married. They had to come to court. They came to court. They fought for the return of their child. The judge said, well, he's erratic, so I am fearful of him being erratic, so I'm only going to return both the babies to you, the mother. This was after a 3-day hearing. So she also had a history of preeclampsia. She had high blood pressure. She had lots of struggles with her own health that she is still to this day not treated because she's afraid to go back to the hospital as a result of what has happened to her in this experience. She had to go back because the judge indicated that he was erratic and was fearful. She had to be placed out of borough because he called it intimate partner violence, even though she did not call it intimate partner violence, because there was no intimate partner violence in this relationship. She really wanted the help because they gave her a C-section, even though that was not her desire for this child, and support with the father. She was not able to get that, and she had to then repack up all of her things in a trash bag, because that's how you move back into the PATH shelter system. She had to wait 24 to 48 hours to get placed in a shelter out of borough, away from her family, and away from the only support. He was only given 2 hours a week supervised to see his child. And I talked a bit already about people with disabilities and individuals. Right now, again, like I stated, in Black Mamas Matters, Sister Song actually wrote an amicus for this law right now, this case, which is called LACL. You should follow it because we are hoping that the Court of Appeals, the highest court in New York, will indicate that you do have to comply with the ADA. So the last kind of the tenets is women in foster system do not have bodily autonomy from sexual reproductive oppression. I think this is also a really important key to hit. And it comes back to what is the foster system. So what we know about the foster system is not only are my clients, typically speaking, products of the foster system, so they were in care themselves as children. Now they are the very people that were raised by the government. They've also experienced sexual trauma in the foster system, and their children are likely to experience sexual trauma in the foster system. In Indiana, in group homes, the rate of sexual abuse was 28 times higher than the rate of sexual abuse within the general population. The ability to escape from sexual assault when you're in the foster system is incredibly impossible for youth in care. They're very disempowered to report. They're very disempowered because they have to manage many different things, right? They're not just managing their sexual assault in their own body, but they're also deciding, you know, in the grand scheme of things, do I want to go to a different home? Do I want to change my community? Do I want to change my school? If I tell my mom, I only have a supervised setting to tell my mom. I don't know if I am allowed to tell my mom. They tell me I can't talk to them. Our clients aren't allowed to talk to their children. I have many reports of children being sexually assaulted in foster care. It's corroborated, and they won't let their parents talk to them. It's this entire system is designed in a way that really fractures communities and does not support them. It does not hold them close. It does not keep them together. Yeah. So I think we're going to open it up for discussion now. That was my cue.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt because there's so much you could share.
Yes. I'm going to go to the last slide. There we go. So I don't know if you guys have questions.
Hear from you and your thoughts and reactions.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just, I think what Lynn and Erin did was, in some ways, provide examples, scenarios of aspects of reproductive sexual birth justice, sort of all of that falling into, under a larger umbrella, that in some ways reinforce, sadly, the problems and challenges, and then in other ways show the incredibly wide range. I'm just thinking right now of what we try to cover in our class, and some yes, and so much of this no. Like there's just not enough space in a a really impactful statement. And Erin referred to some of the work that I've done around welfare policies, and my colleagues and I, looked at policies that particularly were targeted toward the reproductive, procreative, behaviors, for lack of a better term, of poor women in need of, a social safety net, and how when they were mothers, how they were sanctioned for all sorts of things that they weren't doing right as mothers, correctly as mothers. For example, if CPS happened to get involved because of some claim of abuse or neglect, and particularly I'll focus on the neglect, while at the same time the same welfare system was now requiring women to work fair, not even minimum wage, but below minimum wage, work for cash and other forms of assistance as early as 6 weeks postpartum. So on the one hand, being told, if you don't take your kid for regular medical appointments, if your child misses school, if he or she doesn't get immunizations and all other sorts of things, you're not a good mother, and you might have the child taken away from you or be sanctioned and just lose all support. But at the same time, at 6 weeks, go show up at the job that you have to work at to maintain your benefits and not even make minimum wage, much less a living wage. And that's just one little example of so many elements of welfare reform policies that, while the federal legislation was over 2 decades ago, many of these policies are still in place. So with that, I just see like the intersections here, and if we already, some of us thought this was very complicated, it's just been magnified even more so now, and I think the common message is inherent contradiction and absence of any awareness of rights, multiple forms of rights. So anyway, I just said that because I thought those are the things that were occurring to me as I was hearing these different perspectives. And with that, people have questions, comments.
And I guess the only thing I want to just add to that in the framing of why we brought it into this space, having this conversation about borders and the wall, and particularly the punitive immigration policies that we're now faced with, was people's lack of awareness that this is a set of domestic policies that has been with us. But there was outrage, there was compassion for the children who were put in cages and separated from their families, and I don't want to take anything away from that. I just want to say that I just wondered why folks didn't view the foster care system in the same way, because it's done, every day, and it's done in direct ways, but it's also done in these indirect ways through the policies of child welfare and our criminal justice system, as Erin so eloquently pointed out. But we want to hear from you. Any thoughts, questions, reactions at all? Yeah, because they're live streaming, so if you could.
Yes, I'll be the runner. Mic runner.
Thank you. I just was wondering if there's any part of the system that you think is doing something very well. Because it was kind of a damning kind of talk, and recent history, it's a concerning time. So is there any silver linings?
In other words, can people leave here not feeling so depressed?
I had some positive slides in there. I just didn't get to them. Yeah, we can go back. So, my boss took a reproductive justice framework. Her name is Emma Ketteringham, and she created this program called Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies. It's really fine. And it really was designed to stop the womb to foster care pipeline. And what it does is that it works with expectant mothers and also women 0 to 3. We're trying to get that back up again, with children 0 to 3. And it hones in onto the natural biological process called the pregnancy box. When you are pregnant, many people tend to be very motivated at that time period. It is a natural space for people to engage, but what happens is that if you are in a space of coercive services, it's difficult to engage and almost impossible to do so. So people were dropping out of services. So it created a confidential, because it's under a law office environment, for people to engage and tell us, like, hey, I actually legally can't tell anyone if you've used drugs because I will get sanctioned by the bar. Like, I have to be confidential in a way that many spaces don't. And so what we did is that we were able to connect clients and provide ongoing supportive counseling. I'm going to skip to the next. And what we found is that in our 2016, and one day I'll update this, we worked with 248 mothers and new parents. 20 clients were paired with doulas, which is another, I think, radical space where there is a silver lining, because it really is a direct point of intervention that really hasn't been completely defined and co-opted by this, a white supremacist mentality of reporting and structured in different ways. 30 women attended the group and postpartum support group. But what is important is that 79% of the children were never removed from their mother's care. And only 8% of the children were placed in non-kinship foster care. Before this program existed, 17% of children with women who were systems infected were actually returning home to their parents and to their mother. And in 1 year, 79%. And really that was about removing largely the atmosphere, recreating privacy and trying to restructure privacy around where people were naturally motivated. We didn't tell people what to do. They were already naturally motivated to be good to themselves and good to their body. They just didn't have a space to do it.
I just wanted to add to that because I am interested in doula care and midwifery services, and I actually, to answer your question, what good is happening, in April, New York State announced that they would introduce Medicaid coverage of doula care. Many barriers, no updates since April, but Michigan, not Michigan, Minnesota and Oregon have done that, so they're going to follow from them. So good news.
Thanks, Corinne.
And I actually said on the committee that has been very involved in advising the state about that. It's a complex issue, and there are some challenges, and there's been a lot of advocacy about which doula providing agencies will be able to have the access to do that, because there's a whole dilemma around, there's a history of what it means to be a certified doula versus a non-certified doula, what it means to have community-based doulas who have connections to community, like Aaron's talking about, someone who the people already trust to go to and who are more likely to engage in care and support. So and also we're not sure where the movement is on it, because it seemed like it was a pre-primary pitch that hasn't seemed to have been followed through on it yet. But I do sit on the governor's task force. We met last week in Albany, and people are, there is a model, there is a plan to roll it out, but there are some complications from a reproductive justice perspective that people need to attention as well.
So I just wanted to reflect on some of the things that were said about the APS system and foster care and things of that nature. I used to be a CPS worker. So when you're a field worker, you're basically on the front line, and you have little, almost no control as to what goes on. You're literally given 7 days a week to assess a family in a situation, and you have to see if a case is founded or unfounded, and that is such a crucial point in families' lives, because if you do find that a case is founded, this system stays with you until the eldest child is aged out. So I can understand from this standpoint how it's so institutionalized, and literally we almost felt like hopeless because there was nothing we can really do. And now reflecting on it, a lot of the people that we did work with look like you and reflect like you. I was working with all brown and black families, and now I'm thinking, like, was this done purposely? Like, are the workers in the front line black and brown for a reason? And I'm listening to you speak, and I'm just like, wow, like, I was kind of used as a puppet for, to embed in these people's lives. And we don't have a choice, and they don't have a choice. And I was just wondering, like, what can we do and how can we move forward to sort of shift that, if we can do anything?
Well, first of all, thank you for talking about that. I actually struggle a lot because I think what we need to do is be more united as Black women in this conversation together. I often feel like I'm in the courtroom and it's like Black women are the butt of the joke. Like, the judge thinks my client's stupid and lazy. The judge thinks the caseworker is lazy. The judge thinks that I'm saying ridiculous things. And all of us are just feeding this notion to many individuals that don't look like us and about what it means to be a Black woman, and it's very divisive. And then you have the mayor saying, well, this is not a racist system because there are many Black caseworkers. And it's like, yeah, but you know what? Actually, you fired the woman of color when someone died, and you then blamed the frontline workers, and you have terrible policies that are not created by centered communities and are created by largely white elitist people. And then you underpay the people that you put in the front line, overwork them, and then judge them and provide them no resources, and then make them police their own people, and then later say that those policing actions, you put them back in their homes to then quote-unquote social work them. You can't be a police and a social worker at the same time. That's not a relationship to trust. It's destined to fail. But breaking past this conversation has been really hard. And I think the more you can have that conversation and talk to people that you worked with, and we can sit together and have this conversation and this plan, and we have, you know, absent here are my clients, right? And we had that conversation together, I really, truly feel like we could be unstoppable in reimagining the system. Because we care for our own. That's our history. Our history is to care for our own. And we can do that.
And I will say this, and I have a slightly different take on the service end of it, because I was trained as a human service professional was told a long time ago my job was to work myself out of a job, not into one. So with that in mind, I considered, when I was asked to direct a program in 1990 something, and the city had decided in this real small window that they were going to provide support instead of punishment to substance-using moms, and to be able to create a program that was by and for women of color. Our staff was 90% female, of color, but also people who were from the community, some of whom had substance abuse addiction histories. We provided a real one-stop shop model. It came after the prenatal care, so if we could combine what Erin's program, the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies program is doing, because it's capturing that moment during pregnancy. We were capturing women after birth and as a result of a positive toxicology, but with support and not in a neutral agency, because when you looked at that black bar of the services that are all around removal, and then the top bar, right, the supportive services being less dollars than the removal dollars, these were ACS dollars. It was called Child Welfare Administration back then. So the pictures I showed those were all the families that went through that program. There were 20 of them spread out through New York City, but we were a neutral agency because we weren't providing foster care. Most of the programs were providing foster care and preventive services. That's you're like competing with yourself with both aims. So when they mess up, then you can take their children away. We were exclusively doing supportive care through the visiting nurses of New York. People got home care visits, and again, they had, you know, literally around the corner at 125th in Amsterdam from where we are right now. And what they got in that program, because people valued them and reflected them and understood them and cared for them, was pretty remarkable. And we weren't even able to test that out with evaluation data because they disentangled substance abuse treatment services from child preventive, because the state and the city couldn't agree with who should pay for it. So the idea of bringing interagency collaboration solutions, where you're working across systems, where you're working to create models and then finding a way to convince get the political will, because you have to talk to people about this and change the global mindset. Our top recommendation was to change our mindsets about how we view, because you have this conversation, many of our friends, family, colleagues would agree that, you know, if someone's using drugs, they don't deserve to be a parent. And to move away from that, or if they broke the law, they don't deserve to be a parent. So those are the things we have to challenge. We have to do it systemically with culture shifts and narrative shifts, but we also can do it with policies and program models that we create and that come from the community itself. And I have to say, that was the brainchild of people working in the system who changed and decided to do that experiment for a few years. It was only 5 years. It lasted, from, Koch through the end of Dinkins, and then in one fell swoop, it was just dismantled. And that all those policies we saw, all those things that were happening in the 90s, early 2000s, was the beginning of people moving more towards punitive measures. But there's this, again, there are these small windows in time when people sometimes did something that was a little different. I think we're at that moment now because communities are talking about doulas getting care and being wed with legal help. That the Bronx Defenders even exist is a small miracle because of the dismantling of public defenders in general. That happened with a lot of those shifts.
Other questions?
You mentioned the illegal drug testing at hospitals or just not telling the mothers. I'm intrigued to know if you have had conversations with people at the hospital, like the doctors and the nurses who are doing this, and what their thoughts are regarding all of this.
Different people think different things.
Right.
I think it depends on what level. First of all, if someone's having a conversation with me, they tend to be a friendly audience. One time at an unnamed hospital in the Bronx, I was pocket dialed. And I was pocket dialed from a hospital social worker. So I'm looking for these statistics. And she was screaming, this is just a murderer. Woman's never going to get her kid back. Who does she think she is? Thinking she can just come in here and have a lawyer. And you would have thought that my client beat a baby in front of her. Called her a murderer, called her an addict, said she was just a terrible person. How dare she have a lawyer? It was a single positive toxicology for marijuana. Those were the words she was using to describe my client. So there are many people that are very far behind. So what I specifically do is right now I am looking at just the positive toxicology births at Bronx offenders. And what I can say to you is that between August 15, 2017 and August 30, 2018, an 8.5-month period, we looked at all the petitions that were filed within 2 months of a child's birth. And there were 118 petitions during the 8.5-month period, so 118 children under 2 months. And 45% of those cases included an allegation of a positive toxicology. So 45% of those cases were rooted in a hospital call and also rooted in a non-consensual test of a woman and child. And out of 30% of those cases, out of 34% were reported by public hospitals in the Bronx, and only 12% of the cases actually reported withdrawal symptoms. So out of those 118 cases, there was really only 12% of those cases that actually warranted a call to CPS. Because remember, you may have a positive toxicology for marijuana, but that doesn't mean that you've neglected your child. Your child can be perfectly healthy, born great, everything's fine. Only 12% actually had an impact on the child, which is what we're looking at. Not, quote unquote, a bad act, but an impact. But the problem is that there's many pressures on hospital workers to do these reports. There's a lot of education that goes around what CPS is to hospitals. When I talk to many hospital workers, they're like, oh, we just thought we were connecting them to social services. And it's like, well, that's not true. This is a policing unit. It's a child protective unit. That's the purpose, for child protection. You are a hospital. If you want to refer them for treatment, you are the treatment providers. Refer them for treatment. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions and education we can do around those issues.
And of course, there's a version of treatment that is responsive to the needs to begin with, and there are no treatment programs for marijuana, by the way.
There's none.
There's none.
So think about that. If you are getting these positions and people are sitting with different types of users and then are supposed to continue to engage in group therapy and group treatment programs and group treatment models, when maybe people are using different types of substances that aren't the substances that they use.
Very closely related. In places where marijuana is legal, does this look any different?
It does not look any different, and in fact looks worse.
Why?
So interestingly, New York and New Jersey have really progressive laws around positive toxicology in ways that places like Colorado do not. Also, Colorado just recently, for the last 3 years, has an institutional, this is a place I'm thinking of the most, with the most rigorous legalization. In California, it's pretty terrible as well. California is actually one of the worst states. They also just recently have gotten public defenders for parents. So only in the Bay Area would you get a lawyer if your child was removed from you, and only 3 years ago would that be the case in Colorado. So a lot of it is new. You're not entitled to a lawyer in a proceeding where your child is removed from you, in the way that you're entitled constitutionally to a lawyer if you face incarceration. So a lot of this pushing legislation, pushing laws, really comes from a concerted effort from the legal community, in the same way that many of the laws that we had came from public defenders, prisoners' rights advocates that have been doing this work with people affected for years, and it's not constitutionally guaranteed for parents, and in particular mothers, to have the same types of protections.
Well, so I'd hate to say that we have to wrap it up, considering it seems like there's so much to talk about and learn about and discuss, but we're getting near that hour. So a few things. First, I want to thank Marquita again for helping us have this event here, and the Gavin Brown Enterprise Gallery for opening its doors. I want to thank both Lynn Roberts and Erin Cloud for coming, spending time with us. And all of you who are here who didn't have to be here. Although I love my students, I think I think it's it's great that those of you who are not part of the class joined us. Marquita says we don't have to run out the door, so maybe if there's a little time for some one-on-one or conversation when this officially ends. I'm imagining unless anybody's running out the door, maybe the conversation can continue for a few minutes. And there's also some food. Thanks again. Good night.